Good morning. To our honored guests from government, to Professor Prasojo, to the Faculty of Administrative Sciences, the Department of International Relations, colleagues, students, to everyone who took some time this morning, whether in person or whether they are online via Zoom, thank you very much for giving me part of your Wednesday morning. I hope that I will make it worth your time. Let me start with a couple of introductory remarks. I teach in the School of Public Policy and Public Administration at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. My PhD is in comparative public policy. And to an extent, it is true that my natural fit is in public administration and public policy. But if you were to look at my CV and my profile, it is quite diverse. And over the course of my career, I've done research on a number of areas, looking at global finance, looking at comparative finance, looking at digital public administration. I'm currently working on a project on Canadian foreign policy. In other words, there is no rhyme or reason to my research trajectory. But I am really happy this morning to have the opportunity to come and speak to you about my new edited book that is to come out next month. Next slide, please. Oh, can I just say something? So I was watching that video and people were jogging at the end. How you can jog in this weather with this humidity and this heat as a Canadian, I've no idea. The week before I left, we had 55 centimeters of snow and it was around minus 12. So I don't know how you do it. You probably don't know how you do it either. It goes both ways, I assume. So I'm really excited this morning to have the opportunity to come and speak to you to this new edited book. This is called Ineffective Policies, Causes and Consequences of Bad Policy Decision. The book is to be published April of this year, so in just a few weeks. It comes out at Bristol University Press. It is an open access book. So if you find what I'm about to present and what I'm going to speak to this morning, if you find this interesting, then you will be able to go on the Bristol University Press website in just a few weeks and download a copy of the book and of the various chapters of the book. I should point out that this book is co-edited with Malcolm Campbell-Verduin, who's at Groningen University in the Netherlands, as well as Heather McKean-Edwards, who is at Bishop's University in Lennoxville, Quebec, Canada. This is a joint effort that brings together scholars from North America and Europe to consider bad policy. Next step, please. Next slide. This is the outline of today's lecture. I want to speak, this lecture is truly focused in public policy. So it's focused in terms of the policy literature and the way in which the policy literature has developed and evolved. And so I want to spend a bit of time at the beginning of the lecture to discuss the literature on public policy and where the reflection on bad/ineffective policy lands within this literature. I'm going to also speak and define what I mean by bad and ineffective policies. I'll address some of the case studies in the book, some of our lessons learned, the implications, and then I'll draw some conclusions. I will finish with a question that pertains to the Global South towards the end of the lecture. Next slide, please. So the genesis of this project, for those of us who've done work in public policy, how many times have we heard the words evidence-based policy? We need evidence-based policy. Go back to the pandemic. How often did you hear your political leaders, politicians, public health professionals say, we need evidence-based policy? Quite often. Everybody believes in evidence-based policy. I've never met anyone that says we don't need evidence-based policy. We should just do what we like to do. Well, okay, let's exclude the US from the conversation for a minute and some of the recent gestures by President Trump. But most of the time, within the policy literature, we talk about evidence-based policy. So if we have evidence-based policy, if everybody wants evidence-based policy, how is it that we have so many darn bad policies? And thus this book was interested in trying to find out and explain bad and ineffective policies. Now, in the public policy literature, we've long been interested in policy failures. More recently, over the course of the last 15 years, we've had a new literature that has emerged that addresses policy successes. The literature on policy successes largely has taken hold over the course of the last 15 years on the premise that we need to demonstrate the value of the work of government. We need to demonstrate that government, that public bureaucracies, that the public sector works. We need to show that governments at times get it right, that they're not always wrong, and that they are able to produce policies that have long-lasting success. The literature is anchored in this idea of policy successes and policy failures, because when you think about the literature in public policy, when you think about your basic policy models largely are anchored in the idea of the policy cycle. Policy cycle in terms of agenda setting, you're studying your policy options, decision-making, implementation, and policy evaluation. It's a cycle. Within the concept of a cycle is a feedback loop. The policy evaluation is supposed to lead into the beginning of the policy cycle back onto the policy agenda and policy options. It is very much a positive view of public policy in which through every cycle, policy is improved. We should, in theory, as we assess, review, make assessment, evaluate public policy, get better public policy over time. And just like I said, if everybody's talking about evidence-based policy, why is it that we have so many bad policy? Then if we took policy evaluation seriously, then we could assume that policy would improve over time. And again, the argument in this book is public policy making is simply not linear in that way. Policy successes and failure usually refers to how policy meets or fails to meet the policy objectives, whether those objectives are written, whether they are stated, or whether they are unstated. Next slide, please. This book is a bit of a provocation. It says that we need to openly talk about bad policy, that we need to be willing to openly say there are public policies that are bad. Policy scholars in the literature have been very reluctant to do that. In part, I think, and this is just a personal opinion, it's not based in any, it's just, those are my personal observations. In part, I think they're wary of doing that because they're wary of having to pass judgment on policy. They're wary of not being taken seriously as researchers and scientists and scholars. They want to make sure that the field and discipline of public policy is anchored in solid scientific inquiry, which is something I equally strongly believe in. But that has meant that they've been very careful about labeling public policy as bad. Other disciplines, if you search through literature in law, if you search through economics, if you search through international relations and development studies, scholars in those fields are not quite as shy. The press, the public, is not shy about labeling public policy as bad. One of the things that we wanted to do with this book is bring to the forefront and say to policy scholars, you have knowledge, you have expertise, you know both about the policy-making process, but you also have deep knowledge in select policy fields. And you need, as scholars, to exercise your voice and clearly call out policy that is bad and clearly support policy that is good. In order to do that, though, one of the things that we needed to do in the book is to draw some distinctions between bad public policy versus policy failures. A policy that has failed may have failed for a number of reasons. Maybe the implementation was wrong. Maybe there just were not enough resources by which to support the policy that was to be put into place. Maybe the timing was wrong. It doesn't mean it's a bad policy. A policy can fail and not meet its objective and still be highly desirable and revamped and reworked. The other way around is true. You can have a highly successful policy in that it meets the policy's objectives and goals, but it's a bad policy. It's an undesirable policy. So part of the challenge that we're putting to the field here is indeed a certain willingness for normative considerations. A willingness to say openly, out loud, that some policies are good and some policies are bad. How are bad policies to be explained? If politicians, if policymakers, all right, fair enough. We have an underlying assumption. The underlying assumption of the book is that we're going to be able to discover which policies are good and which policies are bad. That science, that research, that the focus on evidence-based policy allows us to identify better policies as well as those that are undesirable. If you don't believe that research allows you to do it, if you believe that it's really difficult or impossible to identify good or bad policies, if you think that rendering those normative judgments, that is not appropriate, then this book is not going to satisfy you. You have to be willing to cross that road and come to the conclusion that through research, through evidence-based policy, we can actually get to better policies and ultimately better policy outcomes. And I think there are times as policy scholars where we know this policy can, should, is going to work. And then we look at some of the decisions by government and we say, we know that this is a terrible policy. We know that it's going to not have the desired impact. And most of the times, Well, let me frame it this way. Politicians and policymakers likely know as well. And yet they go ahead and they implement those policies and those decisions. Again, how do we explain bad policies? Next slide, please. So I have to make a confession. We really wanted to title this book Bad Policies. We really wanted this book to be titled Bad Policies, the Ignoble Side of Government. Bristol University Press, thank you very much to colleagues at Bristol for getting this work through, but they were very reluctant for us to use that title. So based on those considerations, we worked with Bristol University Press and we worked really hard in terms of integrating the concept of bad and ineffective policies together. By bad policy, what we mean is a policy, there are really two core considerations in thinking about bad policy. The first consideration is whether the policy is desirable or undesirable. Ultimately, yes, we pass judgment on whether this is something that government, that a department, that a ministry within a particular field ought to be doing or ought not to be doing. There is an element there that is indeed judgmental, that is normative. You'll see through the case studies why, to an extent, that makes sense. And second, one of the things that I keep reminding my students when I teach public administration and public policy in Canada is what governments do or doesn't do matters. Often, it's not just about whether it's a good or a bad policy or so on. It's a question of life and death for a number of our compatriots. And does what governments do, we often, in particular in political science and in politics, and if you study electoral politics, it's almost a little bit of a game, right? Which political party is going to gain power? What's their program? What's their platform? Is it popular? Are they going to be elected? We view it as a little bit of a sports. In Canada, we often talk about, well, are you talking about the horse race? Behind the horse race are decisions that impact the lives of citizens with serious consequences, with people losing their jobs, with, in some cases, government mistakes even leading to death. I'm not trying to overplay that hand. I'm not trying to exaggerate it. But part of the reason we argue in the book that we need to call out and label bad policy as bad policy is because it matters. What governments do matters. Next slide, please. Now, you may not be able to read that from where you are. I tried to play around with the figure this weekend to make it better, and my PowerPoint skills are obviously limited. So you might not be able to see that to its full extent. It is meant to be simply a continuum from ineffective / bad policy to moderately ineffective / moderately bad policy to moderately good policy, all the way to very, very, very good public policy, what the literature may term policy successes. We acknowledge, we want to be careful here because in studying bad policy, our objectives is not to make government look bad. It is not to say that government gets it wrong all the time. We actually agree with the scholars and our colleagues that focus on policy success that we need to highlight the way in which governments get it right. The focus of studying bad policy, of calling it out, of labeling it. The reason that we think it's important to do so is because when we do so, then maybe we're able to reverse it. So the title that was put forward to this public talk spoke of policy reversals. Bad policy has an element where it can be perceived and seen to be permanent and irreversible. And yet the goal of coming out clearly and labeling it bad policy is so that we can change it, is so that we can get to better public policies. Next slide, please. So this book, the book itself largely focuses on North America and Europe. We worked across 3 policy fields. We worked in the field of environmental studies, new technologies, and the financial services sector. We brought together scholars from both continents, the United States, Canada, a number of European countries that were specialists in these different fields and in these policy and regarding select policies. And we sought to get them to focus on why that particular policy was bad policy. Let me highlight a couple. I have 3 examples from the books that I'm going to highlight. For just under 40 years now, within the field of environmental studies, we've talked about sustainable development. And when you think about the concept of sustainable development, the concept of sustainable development is really built on the idea that you can ensure and continue economic growth in a way that is green, in a way that is clean, in a way that protects and sustains the environment. What if that's wrong? What if the concept of sustainable development, in fact, leads to bad policy? In chapter 3, Matthias Krenke undertakes an analysis of policy documents of the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And within that chapter, he specifically asks that question. So let's make that question really concrete. I've been in Jakarta and surrounding area for just over a week. Just a little bit of traffic. Just a little bit. Just a few cars on the road. All right. You can say, well, at least we should make sure that as many of those cars as possible are EV vehicles. All right. Sounds reasonable, right? Less pollution. We've certainly seen the effects of smogs, of poor air quality in this city. I've been here for a week. Those are things that you just quickly notice. Fair enough. Fine. Maybe getting electric cars on the road would be helpful. But let's push that reasoning further. To get electric cars on the road, you're still building, you're still asking car manufacturers to develop and construct what the consumers want, large SUVs. You're still using all of that metal. You're still using all of that aluminum. You need the battery, for which you need the critical mineral. So you're still encouraging the mining industry and the extraction of natural resources. You're not solving gridlock because those cars are still there. So depending on how you want to assess it, you could make the argument, well, better to have the EV battery than not to have it, which is fair enough. But your quality of life, is your quality of life fundamentally better? Another case study that we have in the book relates to the management, supervision, and regulation of the payday loan industries in Canada and the United States. So this is a very Western case, and the example very much from a North American perspective. So within a Canadian perspective, most people have a bank account. Most people use banking services. But we also know that in Canada, most people, the vast majority of citizens, live paycheck to paycheck. And it may happen that by the time they get to the end of the month, there's not enough money left in the bank account. Not enough money to pay the bills, not enough money to pay the mortgage, not enough money to buy food, not enough money to get gas in the car. How do you get money quickly? You go to what is called a payday loan providers. Payday loan providers provide loans at really what I would argue are exorbitant interest rates to people who are desperate for cash so that they can get to the end of the month. Within a Canadian environment, within an American environment, depending on the jurisdiction, so there are some variations, this is an industry that is almost not regulated, minimally regulated. The only regulation is about the actual rate of interest. And the rate of interest is so high, and in particular, if you are getting these loans multiple times, month after month, or on a regular basis, where it becomes an industry that I would argue prey on the poor. They make their money not from stealing from the rich to give to the poor. This is not a Robin Hood industry. They make their money by stealing from the poor and hoarding it. Now, again, I always want to be careful. They would argue that their industry delivers an essential services, that without it, individuals who need those loans at the end of the month would not be able to get it. I'm pretty confident that we could come up with better policy solutions than allowing the private sector to prey on poor individuals who can't pay their bills at the end of each month. So the book goes from case to case to case, discussing and identifying a number of examples of what we could label bad policy. Next slide, please. The core question of this book is how we explain bad policy. The core of the explanation is what's up there. The first three that are up there, the good politics, bad policy explanation, incompetence and ignorance, and outright ill intent in terms of corruption. There are times when politicians know that a policy is popular. Give you an example. Again, my examples are from North America. I apologize. They may not necessarily be relevant to your case. Let's talk to our friends in political science and international studies. Think about the budget cycle. A new government that gets elected right? If you're going to make cuts, if you're going to make changes, you do it in your first year in power, right? If you've got tough decisions, because you've got 3, 4, 5 more years, depending on the political system in which you operate. And in your 4th and 5th year, now is the time when you're going to give candies to citizens. So in my jurisdiction, where I'm from, my regional government, my provincial government, Ontario, we just had an election. Just before we went to the poll, the provincial government said, it's been a tough year. We've had inflation. Everybody's hurting. The provincial government will send everybody in the province a check of $200 Canadian. We'll just send you a check. Okay. Is sending a $200 check to every citizen good policy? Does that solve any form of policy problems? Sure, for those that are struggling, any money that they can get into their pocket is good money, and it's money that they're going to use, and it's money that they're going to spend. Absolutely, I acknowledge that. But if your healthcare system is struggling, if your post-secondary sector and your education sector are struggling, if you have difficulties meeting some of the core missions of government, is sending $200 checks to citizens good public policy? I have to say I'm far from convinced. But is it good politics? Sure. Thank you, Mr. Ford. Mr. Ford is the premier of the province. That being said, I think it is important to bring forth a few select caveats to the argument that I'm presenting this morning. First, it is true that in particular, when it comes to what the literature calls wicked policy problems, that there may not be obvious solutions. So there are times when some public policy problems are so complex and so overwhelming that identifying what is good public policy versus what is bad public policy is more challenging. Second, perceptions change over time. Science evolves, our knowledge evolves, our understanding of society and the problems that we're trying to address, that changes over time. What we thought may have been the right policy 20 years ago is no longer the right policy. And we need to account for the fact that policy changes over time. And we also need to account that there are circumstances in which, in particular within the democratic states, you're going to have legitimate policy disagreements. And that there are times when policy adversaries are going to label each other's policy as bad or ineffective. It's a discourse, it's a public discourse, it's a way to try and drive home a point. It doesn't mean that the policy that's under consideration is necessarily bad or ineffective. It means it's part of that policy debate and it's part of that landscape. And we need to be able to make that distinction. Once you've done the work, and once you've identified bad policies, and they may not always be good policies, they could be better policies at the very least. How do you get from bad policy to good policy? And ultimately here we can draw extensively from the policy literature because the public policy literature spends a lot of time speaking to how you obtain policy change and how you, what needs to happen for policy change to take hold. Change, when it comes to turning bad policy and for it to become good policy, may be impeded through what, if you're coming at it from a historical institutionalist perspective, would be path dependencies and lock-ins. Once a policy is put in place, once it is set in motion, it may create interests of its own. Those actors which benefit from the policy that have been put in place may find it very difficult to recognize the limits of the policy. It may lead to a policy being set on its own path. And with those actors that are benefiting from what's been put in place, even if it's a bad policy, it becomes difficult to change path and it becomes difficult to overturn it. The cost of moving from bad to good policy may be substantive. Let's be honest, if we're having a conversation about sustainable development and if we're having a conversation about EV cars, and if we were to say this is not an industry, this is not a strategy that we want to foster, again, might very well be a legitimate policy debate. Changing that type of policy would have consequences. It might very well be costly. And thus, considering the cost, it might be that the cost of moving to better policies at time is substantive. Next slide, please. Remember I said that studying bad policy, that studying government, thinking through governments, the way in which government works, what governments do, that it matters, that it's significant. We think that there are consequences to bad policy. And we think that, again, the reason that we need to consider bad policy and the ways by which to get to good policy is because those consequences are serious. We are in an era where there is increasing lack of trust into existing institutions. Certainly within the North American perspective, there is a substantive lack of trust regarding government, substantive lack of trust regarding existing institutions, including universities, and even to an extent, substantive lack of trust regarding large corporations. When governments get it wrong, it accentuates that lack of trust. When governments make not only mistakes, because this is more than policy mistakes. When governments implement and put forth and carry forward on bad policy, then it breeds cynicism. It breeds distrust. That $200 check from the Ontario government, ultimately, it brings forth that question. Are you buying my vote? Oh, by the way, they probably were, and it was successful because they were reelected with a large majority. And I'm going to, again, provoke a little bit more. It's not only about trust. I think in many countries, and I can't speak to Indonesia, but I think in many countries, citizens trust their government less and less and less, but they probably expect less and less and less from their government. And if you expect less and less and less from your government, what's the incentive for government to provide you with more and more and more? And thus we enter this perverse cycle, this perverse relationship where citizens no longer expect that governments will meet their needs. And because citizens no longer expect that governments will meet their needs, they fail to demand it. And when they fail to demand it, then governments do not feel compelled to provide it. Ultimately, bad policy, ineffective policy, is intertwined with democratic regression. And at a point in time, at a point in history, where it does certainly feel to me that we are moving towards democratic regression in a number of states, then that relationship between democratic regression and ineffective policy is one that is worrisome. Next slide, please. When the field of public policy was born, Harold Laswell is considered one of the fathers of the field. And when you think about when the field of public policy was born, Harold Laswell really wanted it to be science-based. He really wanted public policy to be useful, to help address real-world problems. He really thought that through what we now call evidence-based policy, that it was possible to address the challenges with which we are collectively confronted. The field of public policy was born with the desire to make a positive contribution to the development of society. The field itself, and this may be as a judgment a bit harsh, the field itself has largely turned away from that. We focus on the minutiae of the policy cycle. We've developed detailed and extensive theories to try and explain policymaking. But while we've done that, we've moved away from what I think is a core tenet of public policy, which is that positive contribution to society. When you read public policy journals, it is about scholars speaking to scholars. I mean, it's fine. I mean, that's how you get promoted. That's how you get to full professor. I get it. That's why we do it. I think we need to go back to the roots of the field. For public policy to matter as a discipline, for public policy scholars to matter in policy debates, we have to be able and willing to engage, debate, and discuss public policy. We have to be willing to discuss good policies, to highlight when policies can be successful, when policies are desirable. And we have to be willing to call out bad policy. To be very clear, when a policy is either undesirable or when it is, in fact, hurtful and damaging. And I think we would play a much more significant role in society as policy scholars if we were willing to do that. Next slide, please. So I am leaving you this morning with this particular question. This book was centered on You know, one of the things that we say in the book is this applies to Western democracies, in particular Europe and North America. It applies in normal times. And what we mean by normal times is the way in which policy scholars understand that. So the policy cycle usually is, you know, an 8 to 10 year policy cycle. So it is meant to speak to that normal times when policy gets developed and reviewed, and when changes are brought to the forefront, et cetera, et cetera. It's not meant to apply when we look at policies in times of crises or if there's a war or anything of the kind. And we didn't structure our books to think through countries of the global south and implications for countries of the global south. So as we go forward in our discussion this morning, I'm asking the extent to which what I've addressed is relevant to the circumstances to global south countries and is relevant to a country like Indonesia. And if it is, then I'm happy to both have that conversation. And for colleagues in the room, I'm happy to move forward with another project that tries to expand the scope of the analysis to speak to bad policy on a more global level. You've been a very generous audience. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Prof. Ian, for that insightful and also thought-provoking lecture. For me, I think the definition of bad policy is quite relevant for myself. I feel like, okay, it gives me courage to say that, okay, that policy is very bad policy. My family living 500 kilometers from here, and we got really problem with access to healthcare. So I keep asking my parents about how can you get the healthcare access from Pacitan to Yogyakarta. It's quite like 3 hours and give us like, oh, okay, stressful moment is quite traumatic event monthly. So I can say that maybe that's also bad policy for me. So give me like courage to label this policy, maybe it's bad policy for myself. Okay. Thank you for watching. It's quite distressful video, right? Not really a good one. So this video is very relevant to like the and become hot news several days because like 1,000 people got what we call it PHK layoff from the several manufacturing industry with the biggest manufacturing industry in Indonesia. 10,000, yeah, 10,000 employee layoff. Okay. Yeah, so now let us hear from Professor Eko Prasojo, the reflection on Indonesian point of view in terms of bad policy. Please, Prof. Eko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mbak Krishna. Also, thank you for Professor Ian Roberge. This is French name, not English name, yeah. So, comment ça va? Ça va bien. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Pak Wadek, Vice Deans, and also colleagues from Faculty Management, and also Professor Martani Husseini, and also participants from the ministries. This is very fruitful discussions and also presentation from Professor Ian. My question is there any good policy in Indonesia and even in the global, in the countries? No, there is no good policy. There is only good enough policy. There is only best optimum policy, optimum best policy. There is no best excellent policy. This is the propositions of public policy making process. Because if you are making policy, you involving the political interests, the interests of groups, and so on. You are involving the intellectual activities, and you are involving the ideology. this is three variables in policy making process: political interest, intellectual activities, and ideology. So we are in the faculty, in the academic level, should provide the best draft of policy, the good one policy draft. So in the political process, they are bargaining, they are negotiating based on what should I get or what will I get. This is very political perspective of policy making process in Indonesia, especially Professor Roberge. But I think, I sure, it is also happen in the countries because this is the basics. So this is the same question with good governance. There is no good governance. There is only good enough governance. Optimum best governance. Yeah. Sometimes we are talking about evidence-based policy, but factually, actually, we are talking about policy-based evidence. Can you differentiate these two concepts? Evidence-based policy, you look for the evidence first and you make the policy. But policy evidence in Indonesia, you have already the decision and you want the policy analyst to provide evidence. The knowledge, the data, statistic, theoretical perspective, and so on. This is the fact. Policy-based evidence. You find already the policy itself, but you need the argumentations, the justification for the policy itself. So that's why you ask for policy analysts to provide the theory and the evidence. If they are not fit with your, or if you are not fit with their interests, you will be rejected. And you will be not invited again, Pak Martani, to come to parliaments. So welcome, our Dean, and also our Ministry of Setnek. Oh, this is my experience. Sometimes we will not be invited because our opinion and so welcome Ibu Dean, Ibu Dekan. So this is the fact. Policy-based evidence. Okay. Good enough policy, policy-based evidence, three variables of policy-making process: political interest, ideology, and also knowledge. But you have to have the authority. Without authority, we say nothing. So sometimes the academicians, the consultants, I live in three ecosystems, in the policy-making process, in the campus, and also in the consultant. So I know precisely what happened in the policy-making process. So sometimes they provide you with another issue to get actually another issue too. So make you confused. Yes. So they confuse you. What is really the original intent of the policies? This is the fact. Now we are talking about the causes of policy values and its impact. So I have not yet received the presentation from Professor Roberge, but we have the same argument. Next slide. This is the complexity of success policy or failure of policy. So actually, in the cycle of policy making process, we can find what is the causes of policy values. So in the beginning, in the policy design and the policy formulations, so we can find some problem, the potential intended failure policy. You know, intended failure policy. So in the beginning, you are planning for policy to fail. So you listen the comments of Adanang in the trade policy. So they are planning to create policy to be failure. I call intended failure policy. Not unintended. This is intended failure. So you open the import of textile from China, from India. Yeah. This is, so in the policy design level, actually there are some problems of some causes of the policy failure. One is so-called weak problem. Weak problem is the problem that's very complex. You cannot solve the problem by yourselves. You have to involve another ministries. You have to involve provincial level. And you have to involve the kabupaten kota, the cities and the municipality. Makan siang gratis is central government program. And you have to implement this makan siang gratis into the kabupaten kota. This is not easy. Because Badan Gizi Nasional, they don't have representative of central government in the kabupaten kota. How you implement this, actually? This is the problem. This is a big problem. The problem itself is very complex, and you cannot easily solve the problem. Second one is the political interest. I mentioned before that in the policy making process, you are involving the political interest or group interest, business, access to resources, and also power. So economic politics of policy making process. If you get power, you will get access to economic resources. If you get economic resources, you will get the higher power. Oke ya. Waktunya habis, Mbak. Oh, masih ya. Okay. This is the problem about weak problem ya. The second is the third is intractable policy. You know, since in the beginning that the policy is intractable. The policy cannot be easily implemented. So we call intractability of policy. Why intractable? Because we don't have resources, because we don't have knowledge, because we don't have technology, because we have very bad governance. This is so-called intractability of policy. And fourth is chaotic policy. You don't have knowledge, but you propose the policy because of your interest. This is chaotic policy. Messy and chaotic policy. Okay, this is the policy design level is very important to determine whether your policy will be good or bad, or maybe good enough policy. The second one is policy implementations. Kurang. Terlalu besar nanti. The second one is policy implementation. So Professor Roberge mentioned about the competencies, governance. This is actually the problem of implementations. Most of the policy are failed because we don't have any good public governance for implementations. Yeah. So the incapability of public servant. The second one is uncoordinated policy implementations. So we are talking about the collaborations amongst the ministries and agencies, as well as the multi-level governance between central, provincial, and also local governments. How you coordinate the central program to make sure effectively implemented in the local governments. This is not easy because Bupati, Wali Kota, mayor, and head of districts coming from different political background. Yes, we have Kim coalition in the central government, but in the provincial and local governments, cities and municipalities, we have Bupati and Wali Kota with very different political background. Maybe from PDIP, maybe from spirited Kim or something like that. Uncoordinated implementations of program and activities. Horizontally among the ministries and vertically between the central, provincial, and local government. This is most difficult things we have to solve in Indonesia. Multi-level governance, the problem of policy implementation in Indonesia. Yes, we face horizontal problem of horizontal collaborations to create shared outcome among the ministries. The poverty alleviation program consists of 28 ministries and agencies, but they never coordinate in the beginning in the planning and budgeting. So you can imagine 28 ministries and agencies involving in the poverty alleviation program from central government, but they never coordinate in the planning and budgeting agencies in the planning and budgeting process to determine what is shared outcome, joint outcome among the ministries. This is the problem. And sometimes policy clarity. The public servants sometimes do not know exactly what is the objective, what is the goals of public policy. What is the resources need to implement the policies. This is about policy clarity. Sometimes they don't know exactly what is the original intent of policy. And the fourth is contextual factors. Ecosystem, context of policy consists of the political system, social, culture, and so on. And also the political intervention or interference from politics to bureaucracy. This is one of the contextual factors in Indonesia. Yeah. So in the policy performance, the policy will be failure if we cannot determine the clear impact of the policy. What is the original intent to be measured in the policy impact? Yeah, and lack of monitoring. What is the agencies in the central governments responsible for program and priorities in the local governments to monitor? BPKP has only limited authority. They are working based on the order of the government. BPK monitor only the financial compliance, not the performance audit. So in this country, we still have very limited authority to control and monitor the impact of policy. Technically, in the ministries. Yeah, and bad measurements. Instrument of measurements. Yeah, and no feedback. So double loop learning. So we are using the policy evaluations to revise the policy, to improve the policy based on the fact, based on the feedback of monitoring and evaluations. And the policy empowerments also influence. The policy will be bad, good, fail, or meets the objective of the policy sets. So rapid change, globalization, digitalizations, millennializations, and so on. This is rapid change. Regime change. So we can learn now how Donald Trump, changed the regime of the United States from the role model of democracy and merit system So what we are going to see the US now? Because so far I read a paper published talking about rescuing the state capacity in US. So what happened now in US is the increasing of politicization of bureaucracy, the weakening, declining of merit system protections, deploying of politically appointee in the ministries and agencies, and the centralization of authority in the presidents. Yeah, the regime change is very important because suddenly they have to change the existing policy. Change the policy, it is not easy to prepare the policy implementations, key success policy implementations. Because you have to change the competencies, you have to change the mindset and culture, you have to change the coordination among the ministries, you have to change the collaboration among the multi-level governance system and so on. In the regime change, you need to change everything, including the efficiency penghematan anggaran. You have to change APBN, Pak Ari. But I think efficiency is good. So far we have the architecture of performance. But don't cut the budget if you cannot differentiate what is the meat and what is the bone. Because at the end of the year, we create a car without engine because you cut the budget for engine development. Yeah. Okay. Conflict among ministries, conflict that existing in a local governments, yeah, political party conflict and so on, and also political stability. It would also influence the valor or the success of policy. I think this is a lecture for one semester, ya, Mas Rizal, ya, in our course. So thank you very much. I think that's good presentations from Professor Roberge. This is only reflections from what happened in Indonesia actually in the policy design, also policy implementations. Thank you so much for your attention.